What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Perhaps, episode 16. Lent is over. If you didn't know, we just did a whole series during the whole season of Lent. Whole bunch of episodes talking about some of the themes that usually get talked about Lent, but talking about it in a bigger way. You've heard, if you've been listening to these episodes, you've heard me say that phrase over and over, and I appreciate y'all for sticking around. But we're in a new season. I'm not wearing black anymore. For the whole season of Lent, I was just in all black, trying to go all out, and it feels really good to be wearing something else. And today, we're going to talk about Pope Francis. A little bit of what happened. JD Vance may have unalived the Pope. Just kidding. I mean, it's a meme. In case you didn't know, since the vice president went and met with Pope Francis shortly before he died. But Pope Francis has been really sick for a while, pretty old. And I want to talk a bit about the beef that him and JD Vance had before he died. And I also want to talk a bit about his legacy, some of the debates that people have about whether Pope Francis was really all that progressive or not. Because there's, of course, the more popular debates between the progressives and conservatives, and yet there are also debates between the progressives, as there always are. And so I want to talk about that, and then, of course, talk about what's coming. Like, are we going to get a new pope? Is he going to be a cool pope? Is it going to be even better or even worse? We'll see. But I think it's an interesting topic because Pope Francis was very different. I think a lot of times during his papacy, people were very shocked at how different he was. But this isn't just going to be glazing Pope Francis. This will also be talking about it from a more critical perspective too, because on this podcast, we try to really give a much bigger perspective than the simple binary perspectives that we see all the time in the news and in today's discourse. And it's getting a lot more narrow in the way that people talk about events in the world. And so I want to be able to talk about it bigger and even go deeper on these subjects. And this podcast is called Perhaps, partly because it's like when we get to that bigger perspective, things aren't so simple. You got to start having a bigger imagination. And that's when you got to let in a bit of uncertainty and mystery. So thanks for listening. Let's get right into it. Pope Francis passed away on Monday. And I'm going to talk a bit, actually, just repeat some of the things I said in my video on my main channel, Damon Garcia, about the recent mass deportations, and I talked about how some churches were being sanctuary locations for immigrants for a really long time, and some of those rights were being taken away, and ICE given even more power. But I also talked about this beef between JD Vance and the Pope and other Catholics. And JD Vance is actually a recent Catholic convert, but his Catholicism has seemed to be really tied to appealing to the more far-right conservative Catholics. And maybe it's also a legit faith with a legit conversion. I don't really care if it's legit or not, and I have no idea. But whether it is or not, it's definitely been used as a weapon. His faith has been used as a weapon in the culture war, and really to get the support of these very far-right Catholics. And this has been a whole debate among Catholic conversations of like the more progressives and then the traditionalists, and then even among the traditionalists, there's the sort of traditionalists, there's the classic traditionalists, there's the radical traditionalists, the rad trad caths, as some people might call them. And I'm not a Catholic. I've never been a Catholic. I was actually baptized as a baby in the Catholic Church because my parents grew up like loosely, casually Catholic, but not really going to church or anything. And then they started going to church when I was 2, but they started going to a Pentecostal church. And so I grew up Protestant, Pentecostal, but I have a soft spot for the Catholics. Partly because my whole larger family was Catholic at some point, and that all just slowly dwindled away as a lot of them became committed to going to church, but joining Protestant churches and mostly Pentecostal churches. Also, I grew up with in a type of Protestantism that criticized Catholics all the time. And part of my own exploration and deconstruction and finding my own faith journey has been actually looking at the history of Christianity and realizing, oh wait, there's actually some cool Catholics throughout the history of Christianity that I really appreciate, including Saint Francis, who Pope Francis named himself after. Super cool Italian dude, Saint Francis of Assisi. And Saint Francis of Assisi is famous, perhaps the most famous saint, besides the ones from the Bible, who, and partly famous because of his radical commitment to serving people and humility, specifically serving the poor and making himself poor, starting an order of friars called the Lesser Brothers that were super committed to a life of poverty with the poor and giving, being in poverty because they would just give everything they have to the poor, and felt like that was the most just, righteous, and Christian way to live. And so, I mean, yeah, there's so many interesting stories about Pope Francis and that humility. And so, Saint Francis and that humility. So Pope Francis wanted to model that humility, and from the beginning was very committed to that radical commitment to caring for the poor and speaking against those who abuse the poor. And that included speaking up for immigrants and refugees as well, which seemed very radical for a lot of people. And JD Vance used his faith to continue the oppression of immigrants, to justify the continuing of oppression against immigrants. And so in January, when JD Vance was questioned about mass deportations in an interview on Fox News, this is what he said. He said, there's this old school, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens and your own country. And then after that, you can focus on and prioritize the rest of the world. And a lot of the far left has completely inverted that. They seem to hate the citizens of their own country and care more about people outside their own borders. That is no way to run a society. Now, if you know me, you know that this gets me worked up when people use their faith to justify oppression. And what I'm really passionate about is finding another way to reframe your faith, to empower you to fight for justice and to be in solidarity with those who have been oppressed by their governments and by the church. I wrote it's behind me. I wrote a whole book called The God Who Riots, Taking Back the Radical Jesus, about these two streams in the history of Christianity. And so I'm not the only one that got worked up about JD Vance's terrible twisting of Christian concepts. He got a lot of backlash, and he responded to the backlash by tweeting, just Google Ordo Amoris. And Ordo Amoris is an old Catholic Latin term, which means order of love. And it comes from St. Augustine, super duper old saint. And St. Augustine, when he talked about the order of love, he was mostly talking about loving God first, like loving in the right order and loving God first, and then other people, as a way of just like prioritizing the way of the God and your faith and spirituality and what you believe God wants you to do and all that. And yet JD Vance takes that concept to justify discrimination against other people. And I think what's especially troubling about this is when we look at the Bible, there's again and again and again verses about caring for the marginalized, caring for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and often the immigrant. And even like when you see God, this being wrathful, it's usually because he's wrathful against people for not living justly and caring for the marginalized and caring for the immigrants especially. God will harp on throughout the Bible because he'll say again and again, hey, my people, Israelites, you were once foreigners, immigrants, strangers in a foreign land, in Egypt, in slavery. And now you're freed. And so you should remember where you came from and continue to take care of foreigners and immigrants. And that he would say that to people generations after slavery in Egypt. And guess what? In the United States today, we have a lot of European-blooded people generations after their ancestors were immigrants to this country. And I believe God would tell them the same thing. Like, remember where you came from. Remember who you are. Take care of immigrants. Welcome them. They should have equal rights. Also, it's like the Christian thing to do. Or, I mean, yeah, I'm talking about Old Testament and New Testament. So not just the Christian thing to do, but the godly thing to do, the Christ-like thing to do, the prophetic thing to do. And that's also like why it really pisses me off to see people use their faith to justify discrimination. It's like you're just completely ignoring your faith, not following your faith. And so when he said this, backlash, and then Pope Francis actually responded, especially to this twisting of Ordo Amoris. And he didn't directly call him out, but Pope Francis released this letter to the bishops in the United States, and he was criticizing the immigration policies. And this part of that letter criticizes and references what JD Vance said without naming him. He says, this is from Pope Francis, one of the final words we got from him. This was a couple months ago. He said, Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. In other words, the human person is not a mere individual relatively expansive with some philanthropic feelings. The human person is a subject with dignity who, through the constitutive relationship with all, especially with the poorest, can gradually mature in his identity and vocation. The true Ordo Amoris that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. So in other words, your concept of love as a Christian shouldn't be one that closes yourself off to people outside of your community, because that's what JD Vance is saying. It's like, because I'm a Christian, there's this Christian concept that says we should only care about us and not them. But Pope Francis is saying, like, no. Christian love is supposed to encourage you to continue expanding your love more and more and more to a radical extent that you end up loving the people that others aren't willing to love. That's what your Christian faith is supposed to be empowering you to do, to love even more, even outside of your community, not less people, more people, not less people. And yet we all have experience, I'm sure, with Christians who seem to use their faith to argue that they're justified to love less people, love less and love less people. And yet, I'm sure there are a lot of you here who still have some sort of relationship with your faith, whether you're still a Christian or not, or just dig Jesus, or just simply dig the way that I talk about some of this stuff, who hold on to that idea that, oh yeah, this faith stuff, this religion, spirituality stuff is supposed to be encouraging, inspiring, empowering us to love more and more and more. And what's cool is Pope Francis was always committed to that idea of Christian love, which was really refreshing for a lot of people. And so anyway, JD Vance didn't directly respond to this, but he had a speech at a National Prayer Breakfast where he kind of referenced it, and I think it was more a response to some of the backlash in general. And he said, I'm still a baby Catholic. I'm still learning. But he also wanted to curb some of the criticism against the Pope. But my guess is he probably knew he would get way bigger backlash if he did criticize the Pope. So I think JD Vance was just being smart about what he said and who he criticized, and just probably knew Pope Francis wasn't gonna be around for much longer. And it was even while he was sick, I think, that he gave that response. I mean, he had been sick for a while, but I mean, while he was hospitalized. And so I think JD Vance was just like, this guy isn't gonna be around for much longer. I don't want to start more beef than I need to. Let's just continue to respect the Pope. And then on Saturday, he met with some cardinals, and those cardinals pretty much shared the same sentiments that Pope Francis had shared, and were criticizing some of the immigration policies, and they shared back and forth some opinions. But separately from that meeting, JD Vance had criticized those cardinals and some of the other Catholic leaders that were criticizing some of his actions and Trump's actions, and he said basically that these guys are just mad because the recent cuts to foreign aid meant that that the Catholic Church had to cut some of their charities and programs that were helping refugees. And JD Vance accused them of just wanting to keep that money, which one cardinal was like, that's very nasty, ridiculous. And yeah, it is ridiculous. I mean, and it's, yeah, I mean, there's a whole other conversation right now about the recent cuts to different government programs and charities, nonprofits. And we're seeing, backlash to that. And JD Vance is just trying to defend himself. He's definitely not open to considering people who say, if you're really a Christian, if you're really a Catholic, you shouldn't have these policies. I don't think he's open to that. And I think it's because his faith isn't really about trying to be the most faithful. It's just about staying committed to these American Christian nationalist, borderline Christo-fascist policies, and just using his faith to justify it, not to try to let me dig into this thing and really understand the life Jesus lived and the life Jesus calls us to, and what the Bible says, or what some of these Catholic leaders are telling me. I don't think he cares. And I think this appeal to his faith doesn't really work. The same with Trump, where you see a lot of Christians being like, you're using evangelicalism as a justification. And actually, this is what the Bible says. Actually, this is what Jesus would do. It just doesn't work because they're not really about their faith in the way they say they are. And so it's interesting to see. But then JD Vance met with Pope Francis himself recently, out of the hospital, but still really, really sick. And they we don't know what that conversation was like. And JD Vance, I forget what he said, but I think he just said, we had a nice conversation. But even if Pope Francis did criticize him, or they had some sort of disagreements in that conversation. I doubt JD Vance would say, but especially he wouldn't say because hours later, Pope Francis went into cardiac arrest and passed away. And so JD Vance especially isn't going to say anything bad about Pope Francis or what happened in that conversation. But this, of course, led to a lot of memes of like, oh no, JD Vance killed the Pope. Come on, why'd you do it, JD Vance? People responding to his tweets like, why'd you kill the Pope? And it's funny in general just because of the timing, but I think people especially find it funny because they had this beef at the end of his life, and people really liked this Pope, and people really not liking JD Vance. So it's an easy jab, it's an easy joke. But yeah, it was unfortunate. Pope Francis was really, really sick at the end of his life. But I thought, I don't know, maybe the Holy Spirit would keep him going for a while longer. But we'll see what happens for the next one. But let's talk about the legacy of Pope Francis for a bit. Because what's interesting is he was known as being pretty progressive. I say that word carefully. But the thing is, he was progressive for a pope. You know what I mean? Which is like from one angle, saying quite a lot. From another angle, not saying very much. So I want to be honest here with the way we talk about this. Because yeah, I've dug a lot of things that the Pope has said and done. I have some of his books. I have next to me to my left, I'm looking at a bookshelf. But yeah, the Pope is cool. But at the same time, I think publicly I haven't really praised the Pope that much because I'm also aware that he's still the Pope. Like the Catholic Church is still, in a lot of ways, as an institution, responsible for a lot of oppression. I mean, even like as a Mexican American, like I exist. My culture exists partly due to the Spanish colonization, and which was initially justified with Catholic theology. I mean, the Pope signed off a whole letter to the king justifying colonization back then, and yeah, we could get into a long thing of like the history of the sins of the Catholic Church, but I think also there have been a lot of other voices, Christian voices, that are a lot more progressive. But it was always interesting to hear these somewhat progressive things coming out of the mouth of a pope. And I think that is why so many people have talked about him and some of the statements he's made and differences he's had with other popes. And so let's get into some of that. A lot of times he shocked the world. But specifically, like I was saying earlier, because of how outspoken he was for the poor, marginalized, and immigrants. And even like in 2016, he said about Trump, criticized Trump for some of his anti-immigrant policies, also criticized other anti-immigrant political leaders. But in 2016, he said, a person who thinks only about building walls wherever they may be and not of building bridges is not Christian. This is not the gospel. And that was especially powerful within the context of so many conservative Christians supporting Trump. Also, Pope Francis acknowledged the church's role in Canada's residential school system. While people were talking about its historic violence against Indigenous children, including murder of Indigenous children in those schools. And Pope Francis apologized. And even though there had been some different kinds of apologies from popes in the past, like Pope Benedict apologizing to sexual abuse survivors, the image of a repentant pope was still like really refreshing for a lot of people. While at the same time, it wasn't really enough. And we'll get to that. But it's still remarkable, like in the literal sense of worthy of being remarked, you know? And Pope Francis spoke a lot about climate change. I think that's one of the books I have on my shelf is the bookification of the encyclical that he released, Laudato Si, about caring for the earth and curbing climate change and criticizing capitalism and political leaders that weren't doing anything about climate change, and going through like so much of the Bible and old Catholic social teaching to explain why it's like the Christian thing to do to care for the earth. And that was really powerful. And again, you would see Pope Francis speak out for justice and at the same time still being a pope and not doing a lot of the changes that a lot of people were hoping he would do. And still like holding on to some of these discriminatory traditionalist Catholic views. And it would confuse a lot of people. And a lot of people would get into these debates over whether he's a conservative or not, or a progressive or not. And I think the reality is Pope Francis was just a traditionalist, conservative Catholic. But he was a traditionalist, conservative Catholic who took his faith seriously. For him, those statements for justice wasn't him trying to be progressive. It was him trying to follow the gospel and be honest about the gospel and what Jesus calls us to. And he read the whole Bible. And he didn't ignore the parts about justice like we see so many Christian leaders do. I think that's all that Pope Francis was doing. I don't think he was trying to align himself with a certain political position or strategy. He was just a Christian who took his faith seriously. And when you do that, you wind up having some pretty radical progressive or leftist views. And I think a lot of you who are into my work recognize that too, where you grow up in church being told about this Jesus, and he seems pretty radical, pretty inclusive, loving, progressive in a lot of ways. And yet it doesn't align with some of the Christian leaders you see and the ways that these institutions are structured. And it feels like these Christian leaders are actually at a step with this radical Jesus they're teaching me about. And a lot of people end up leaving their Christian communities, including a lot of Catholic churches, not as like a rejection of this Jesus, but more so they feel like led out of these Christian communities by Jesus, feeling that if I really want to be faithful to this radical Jesus that you taught me about, then that leads me to reject the ways that you've completely twisted this Jesus into some pretty horrible politics. And so, because of that, Pope Francis didn't really fit neatly into these categories. And I think you see that a lot with a lot of Latin American Christians and Catholics in general, is that they don't neatly fit into the American progressive conservative binary. And so I think, that makes him really interesting. And when we talk about Pope Francis and his legacy and his politics and his theology and his views, we have to be willing to step outside of those American political binaries to really understand what's going on. And I think what we kept seeing throughout his papacy is that he would do these really positive things, say these really positive things, but ultimately it wasn't enough because the institution that he's leading is still structurally oppressive. Like, let me say some more things about what he did. And he created the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, dedicated to preventing sexual abuse in the whole global Catholic Church. And he also met with and apologized to a lot of survivors of sexual abuse. And a lot of those meetings were reported on, a lot of them weren't. It was just important to him in general. And yet at the same time, so much abuse in the Catholic Church is still being covered up. And it seems sometimes Pope Francis wasn't doing enough about that. He also made history by allowing women to head administrative departments in the Vatican and put more women in senior Vatican roles than any other pope had. But at the same time, he was still against women clergy. Here's another one. He also famously was asked about gay priests in 2013. And he said, if someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? Do you remember that? That was like such a shock. I remember that. People were talking about it for such a long time. And he also spoke against the harshness of in the treatment, the harshness in the way that Christians treated gay people. And in 2023, he said that priests can bless same-sex couples. And that caused a huge uproar. And it was funny to see people being like, oh, cool, Pope Francis is pro-gay. This is awesome. Other people were like, oh no, Pope Francis is pro-gay. This is evil. But at the same time, when he said that, he was referring to like the type of blessing where people come up to priests and ask for like a general blessing from the priest. That was the type of blessing he was referring to. He didn't mean blessing their marriage or even seeing it as like an official marriage sacrament and recognizing it as a marriage, or blessing their partnership in any way. But even that, just still giving them a general blessing was a shock to a lot of people and a lot of Catholics. But it's because of the Catholic Church's homophobia. And so that sometimes it would be just these minor, somewhat inclusive statements that would still be such a huge shock because of where it's coming from. And also in 2015, he announced that priests were allowed to offer forgiveness for abortions, like the full-on forgiveness, absolution of sins for people who had abortions. But still anti-abortion. But again, it's like even the forgiveness and absolving people for abortion was still a big shock because of where it's coming from. And so Pope Francis was a symbol of hope for change for a lot of people. We have to really recognize that. And we have to recognize that he was able to shine so brightly as a symbol of hope, even as a leader of a historically very oppressive institution, because of how hopeless so many people are. In some ways, like, a lot of people will take hope wherever they could find it, you know? And so I see this debate between progressives. I mean, there's the more popular debate between the conservatives and progressives supporting or not supporting the Pope. But even among progressives, there is, Catholic and non-Catholic, Christian and not Christian, of people who would see these little inclusive things that Pope Francis would say or do and be like, oh, this is awesome, this Pope is cool. And then other people would be like, he's still the Pope. this isn't enough. What about this other thing that Pope Francis said or did? Like, let's not praise this guy. And I get it. But I think I get both sides. And so I think there's three major reasons, three major categories of people who would praise Pope Francis, who are progressive or progressive-ish, left-ish, whatever. I think you get what I'm saying. But first, there's the people that just never hear any Christian voices that speak up for justice, for marginalized people, for immigrants, for the earth, caring for the earth. Like, I think some people who are really like deep into this other way of viewing Christianity, and some of these progressive theologians, leftist theologians, this wider way of seeing it, recognize like, oh yeah, there's a history of this different radical stream. There's all these other books out there, podcasts, people, voices out there that are about using your faith to fight for justice. But we got to think about the normies and realize a lot of people, dare I say most people, never hear these radical Christian voices. And Pope Francis is like the only Christian voice they would ever hear say anything somewhat progressive, somewhat pro-justice. And every single other Christian voice they hear is just horrible and bigoted. I think we really have to remember that when we see people praise Pope Francis. That's the only like somewhat cool Christian voice they hear. And this debate, I think, is especially confusing for them. And we have to remember, like, yeah, we have all these other voices, including mine, including people who are much, much bigger and influential, and more books and more people are familiar with them. But none of these voices are famous. Like, not only are they not as famous as the Pope, but they're not famous at all. We have to remember that, people. Pope Francis is like the only super famous Christian voice right now that was saying these like very pro-justice, progressive, inclusive things. And yeah, this other perspective of Christianity is out there, but within an individual, you don't really see that as much. Like, and I'm saying like the normies who don't know anything about Christianity or any of that aren't into like reading up about it or looking at news about it. Like, if you were to ask them, I think there's a lot of them that it's like, oh yeah, Pope Francis is cool. He's the only one that I think that's why so many of them would get so excited when they would hear stuff like that, because it would feel like he's the only one. He's the only Christian voice that's actually kind of cool. And so I think that's the first category of progressives who would praise Pope Francis. Secondly, I think there's people who are familiar with all these other voices, but are just so happy to finally hear messages like this from someone in that type of position. And it gives them hope that this message won't remain obscure and will start to spread, and other people will hear this and hopefully be a part of some sort of cultural shift. I think we have seen that. I've seen it all the time. People would be very inspired by the stuff that Pope Francis was saying, and that would encourage them to start looking into other different voices until they start getting into more radical voices and more radical perspectives, which is cool. And so, and then also the constant criticism of Pope Francis from conservative Catholics made Pope Francis more sympathetic. And so sticking up for the Pope in that context felt even cooler, because it felt like, yeah, anything to make these ultra conservatives mad. Oh, they're all saying Pope Francis is the devil for being somewhat inclusive. I love Pope Francis. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's another thing we would always see why people would praise him. And so, and then thirdly, the third category of progressives that I've seen praising Pope Francis is people who just want to signal boost whatever positive message they see, no matter who it comes from. And I think these people are like, would sometimes get annoyed at like the people who try to police their reposts and quotations and endorsements and feel like how could you repost this person? How could you quote this person? How could you praise this person? Don't you know that they've also done and said these other things? And it's like, there's times where that's very valid criticism. But again, let's think of the normies. I think most people are like, I just like that thing he said. I don't know what he's done. I don't know who he is. I just thought this one thing was cool. And so, and I think it's worth it for those people to also learn the full story, the full context of like who these people are that they're quoting. What is this perspective actually saying? What are the things actually being left out? Like this statement seemed pretty positive, progressive, inclusive, but then let's also consider these other things. But I think a good criticism also has been, what about all these other voices that we need to boost? Like, I think that's been at the heart of some people who, like, let's talk about the other side. The people who say, why are you praising the Pope? He's still the Pope. And what about all this other stuff? Come on now. Let's not lose sight here. From that perspective, I think there has been really good criticism from that side. And I strongly sympathize with this perspective that there are so many other voices speaking out for justice. So many other Christian and Catholic voices speaking out for justice that are more radical than the Pope and are more holistic in the way they talk about justice than the Pope, that we also need to boost as well. And I get that. And it's also like, it's going to take a lot of work to boost those voices. But I get it. And I think the other thing that I really sympathize with and those critics, skeptics, is that there's a long history of so many of us who have been traumatized by the betrayal of so many of Christian leaders within our lives and communities, but also like in like on the world stage, like these famous Christian leaders, or just famous supposedly morally righteous people who inspired so many people and then turned around and ended up being exposed as abusers, liars, bigots. I think so many people are traumatized by that and righteously critical of the way that we put people on pedestals as like these role models for our morals, and want to see a world where we don't idolize people in that way. And so when they see someone like talking about Pope Francis like he's purely 100% good, it makes sense why they push back on that and say like, why are we idolizing this guy? Like, it's not. Haven't you seen the problems with idolizing people in this way, putting these individuals on a pedestal and expecting them to be these morally righteous role models that will lead the way. That doesn't work. And the Pope was never going to change. The Pope was never going to be our guy anyway. The Pope, real radical change that we need, was never going to come from the Pope anyway. And I think that's also at the heart of that criticism as well. Is like, this isn't our savior. This isn't the guy who's going to save us. And any good major change that we see institutions make, religious institutions and political institutions, often come because of the pressure from the people. It's in response to pressure from people. And a lot of people think that this is the only way to make change, is to continue just, when we want a change, put the pressure on our leaders and then they'll do it. Or try to elect good leaders and they'll do it. And I think there's also like a lot of leaders of institutions that appeal to that belief and respond to the pressure of the people because they want people to continue believing that that is the only way to make change. But eventually, I'm hoping people will realize that we're the ones with the power. Sometimes we get people appealing to us and be like, okay, fine, I'll change. But we're the ones with the actual power that we're allowing these leaders to have. And eventually, we have to be able to learn how to use that power collectively in solidarity with each other and start using that power for ourselves. That's where change is already coming from. We're just using it to put pressure on leaders, and then the leaders make changes. But it's like, consider where it's coming from, and then imagine a world where we actually understand where the power is actually coming from and how we could use that power if we came together and realized we actually have it. You know what I mean? Like, that's where change is going to come from. Below. It's going to come from below, not from above. And so I see a future pretty far out, but I see a future where Christianity continues, but not in the form we see it, where it's controlled by a lot of these major institutions. And I could see a future where things become more decentralized, more democratized, to the extent where we don't even have a pope. Like I think Catholicism is going to stay around. I think all these Protestant denominations, not all of them, but some Protestant denominations are going to stick around. But it's going to look very different. And it's going to go in the direction of decentralization, democratization. And any leaders would be more of like a servant role. And I think that the same will happen with businesses. Where the future, I'm thinking like post-capitalism, the chief executive officer role will not be like so much like a king who makes all the decisions, but would be more of a administrative, organizational role. And power would be more democratized. And so I think we're going to see that the same thing happen in both religious, political, economic institutions. And so we'll see. We'll see what happens with this pope, with the upcoming popes. But that's what I see the future as. So now let's talk about the next pope. So the Conclave. Y'all see that movie, The Conclave? It was pretty cool. The Conclave is going to happen where these cardinals come together and try to vote for a new one. And they have 4 voting rounds each day I don't think it started yet, but it's going to start soon. And the goal is to reach 2/3 majority vote. And they keep on having these votes until they reach that. And I read that if no candidate is voted after 33 rounds, then 2 frontrunners will then have a final runoff vote. But I want to say, like, a lot of people are debating, oh, is it going to be like a progressive-ish guy like Pope Francis, or is it going to be a more traditionalist conservative guy and tarnish the legacy of Pope Francis? I think what a lot of people are missing is we're paying attention to the wrong demographics. Let me tell you, Christianity is rapidly increasing, or rapidly, first off, declining in North America and Western Europe. But it's rapidly increasing in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So some people call Latin America, Asia, and Africa the global South, or the global majority, because that's where the majority of people are, even though the majority of power and control is with the global North or the West, or these North America and Western Europe. The majority of people are in the global South, the global majority. And so that is partly why we're seeing such a rapid increase in Christianity there, but it's also a rapid increase in conversions. And it's a very different kind of Christianity than what Americans are familiar with. Like, it's still conservative, but like mostly conservative, but it's conservative in like kind of a different way than Americans understand conservative, progressive, binary. And a lot of Americans need to think beyond American Christianity, but it's an interesting conversation. And so I read that some estimates suggest that by 2050, 78% of the world's Christians will live in the global South. And African Christianity, in particular, is rapidly growing. And data suggests that by 2050, 40% of the world's Christians will live in Africa. And that's for both Catholicism and Protestant Christianity. But in Africa, Catholicism is growing even more. And the Vatican even said that the future of the Catholic Church is undeniably in Africa. And I think it's an interesting conversation, especially for Americans who think their world is the world. But it also really matters in this upcoming election of a new pope. The demographic center of the Catholic Church is no longer in Europe or North America, and it's not even close. So when it comes to electing a new pope, these are the demographics that really matter. And people are talking a lot about, is it going to be a progressive, conservative, traditionalist? But these demographics are an even bigger determining factor. And what's funny is that the candidates that are being considered that are like a little more progressive, they're all European except one. Like, they're more liberal on issues of like same-sex marriage and abortion and working with people of other religions, interfaith conversations, and social justice. But if they're not elected, it'll probably have less to do with their more liberal views and more to do with them being European. And not really representing the global Catholic Church. And also the 2 African cardinals that are being considered are very traditionalist, very conservative, and also supporting Ghana's violent homophobia and persecution of gay people. And so it seems like that's a huge possibility, but the only non-European guy has some progressive-ish views that might get elected is Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, who's Filipino. And he has even been called the Asian Francis, And if he wins, he'll be the first Asian pope. So it'll be pretty historic. And but yeah, he has more inclusive views and committed social justice in different ways. And so that guy's like probably the only hope for someone that could potentially continue the direction of Pope Francis's legacy in that way. So that's my that's the guy I'm rooting for. But I mean, kind of rooting for, because ultimately I have no stakes in this. I'm not Catholic. I don't really care, to be honest. Well, I will care. Actually, I will care if a more traditionalist guy wins. I'll be worried. That'll be my care. I'll be worried. And if Tagle wins, I'll just be a little less worried. That's where I fall in this discussion. But we'll see. It'll happen. It'll happen soon. And anyway, I hope this whole deep dive into the legacy of Pope Francis and some of this debate and discourse around the kind of guy Pope Francis was gives you a bit of a bigger, more nuanced perspective. And like I said, ultimately change is going to come from below, not from above. I mean that religiously and politically. And we'll see what happens next. Shout out Pope Francis. Rest in peace, Pope Francis. Like I said, I've loved a lot of things he has said, and I think y'all should check out some of the things he's said, especially that Laudato Si encyclical about caring for the earth and climate change and stuff. I think that's some of the coolest things he's ever put out. But on to the next one. We move forward. Screw you, JD Vance, for taking out my guy. And I'll see y'all next week. All right, later.